Hello and welcome to The Plain Truth, and this week we're going to be talking about performance calculations. Joining me as always is the legend that is Captain Al. Hi Captain Al.
Hi Matt.
Right, okay, now this one's come in from a listener this week, so thank you to Nick for sending this in. Basically, the summary is, how would you go about performing takeoff calculations?
Okay, so this is a simple question with a very complicated and convoluted answer, which I'll try to split up and section it off in as much as I can. So we'll start with the very basics. When we are going to perform a takeoff, we need to be certain that the aeroplane will get airborne. So one of the things that we will do before we decide how much payload we can accept. So payload is the passengers, the bags, and any cargo. It's the stuff that we're being paid to carry, okay? We will work out how much payload we can carry. So how do we go about that? Well, obviously, we know which aeroplane we're in, so the performance data will be quite specific to that very individual airframe. We know where we're at, as in which airport, and then we can start to narrow it down to which runway, because obviously some airports might have short runways, long runways, and this of course is dependent on the weather conditions that prevail. So we will work out what the maximum payload is for that aircraft using that runway with the weather conditions that prevail, and quite significantly whether the runway is wet, dry, covered in snow, covered in ice, etc., etc. So that's our payload, and that's the maximum amount of weight that we can get out of that airport. So when we've actually boarded all the passengers, and we've talked in a previous episode about weight and balance. So in light aircraft, you might look at actually weighing passengers. Whereas on large aircraft, we use assumed weights. Now, the assumed weights are set by the authority, and some people will say, well, you know, I'm a big chap. Okay, well, for every big chap, there's a little chap. So it kind of all averages itself out. Okay. Now, big dividing line here. In Europe, most airlines will allow the crew to do their own performance calculations, or the airline will subcontract the performance out to a company and the pilots will cross-check it, double-check it. In the United States, they have an entirely different setup. So they have flight dispatchers, and it's the flight dispatchers who will do the performance calculations, or a separate department, but usually it's not the pilots. Horses for courses, you know, apples and pears, it doesn't really matter. Someone is doing the calculations. In days gone by, and indeed when I started flying, when Wilbur and Orville were still, you know, middle-aged, we used to do performance calculations with big tables. So you'd have a huge library on the aircraft. You'd say, okay, I'm at Manchester at runway 24, because don't forget, in these days there wasn't a second runway, so it was runway 24. You'd find the runway 24 page. You'd go into the dry page or the wet page or the contaminated section, that's with snow and ice, etc. And you would know the weight of the aircraft because you'd have the load sheet. You'd go in and you'd match it up with the temperature, and that would give you your performance speeds. Now, one of the things that we try to do on aircraft is we look after our engines because they're very, very expensive and they use lots of fuel. So in the same way as when you drive your car, when you're starting off driving away from stationary, you have the option, don't you? You can either gently accelerate or you can absolutely floor it.
I mean, the latter one is more exciting.
The latter one is more exciting, but this is aviation, so we try to keep excitement down to a minimum.
Fair enough, yes, yeah.
And we try to think safe option, okay?
Boring.
So what we will do is, based on the weight that we've got and the temperature, etc., runway conditions, blah, 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 we will come up with a set of speeds. So V1, our rotate speed, our V2 speed, and we will also come up with a temperature. It's an assumed temperature. In the Airbus world, we call it flex. I think Boeing call it D-rate. It doesn't really matter. It's an assumed temperature. So basically, what we're telling the engines is that it's a lot hotter outside, so therefore they will produce less thrust, because engines can't produce the same amount of thrust when it's hot. So we're giving the engines or the computers a false figure, so they produce less thrust, i.e. we're taking off with enough thrust to be safe, but we're not going full power. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. The whole thing about fooling the engines is just that it's just a way of doing it. So that's our performance calculation, and we would do that on a table. And then as things like laptops and latterly tablets came to be quite sophisticated, clever, cheap, and robust, people started to look at this performance and went, hey, we can, calculate this electronically. And it was kind of worked out within Monarch Airlines that massive savings could be made by basically being more accurate with these calculations. Because when you're doing it manually by tables and charts, you're always going to err on the safe side because you're interpolating, and you might be interpolating between 4 different boxes. Unless you've got an instant Excel spreadsheet and you're going to put all this data in to come with absolute values, you're going to basically look at it and go, well, okay, it's somewhere between 52 and 56. So 52 is the safer figure. We'll go with 52. Now, it might be that if a computer did it, it came up with 54. So there's 2 degrees of temperature difference there. And what the vendors of these electronic performance packages came and said, well, for an airline of Monarch size, for every degree of flex that you save over the year will save you about $500,000 US. So 2 degrees of flex, well, there's $1 million saved. And I'm minded of a very astute training captain who was from a part of Wales where arms are short and pockets are deep. And he said, all we need to do is just add 2 degrees manually and we'll share the $1 million then. Well, it doesn't quite work like that. The regulator needs to see a bit more evidence of this taking place on a more scientific way. But we had electronic performance, and therefore you put the data in. And the key thing then is that you independently, so each pilot has a tablet, you independently calculate the performance. You compare what you've got, and then you put it into the flight management system, and off you go. Now, like anything else in life, when we put stuff into computers, we can make mistakes. It's very easy to mistype a 3 for a 4 because they're next to each other on the keyboard, etc., etc. And as you know, Matt, because you're a computer guy, you'll be familiar with the old saying of rubbish in, rubbish out.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
So long as the data fits within the very broad parameters, the iPad, the PC, whatever you're using, will go, well, that's what you've told me it is. That's good enough for me, and I'll spit you out this figure. Now, unlike when you were looking at charts and tables, you kind of had a bigger aspect to this. And my analogy for this is that most of us now navigate in our cars, trucks, buses using sat-nav.
Yeah.
And we just follow what it says. When we used to use road atlases, we had a much bigger picture. So you're of a similar generation to me. So if you had to drive from Bungay to Manchester, you have a pretty good idea as to how you're going to get to Manchester without consulting your sat-nav, don't you?
From
it
here,
might not be,
head north.
Well, there you go. It might not be as efficient as using your sat-nav, but you would get to Manchester. Yeah. And you would have a good idea if your sat-nav started to say, turn south, that something has gone wrong, and you might have the wrong Manchester in your sat-nav.
Yeah.
But for those people who don't have that kind of big picture, this has been the big problem. So where people have made data entry errors, they've either been in the preliminary calculations on their devices or then putting them into their FMS. And again, so long as the aeroplane goes, well, it looks okay to me. You've not told me that it's 140 degrees centigrade outside. You've told me, that it's 55. That's good enough, because it could be. So these are where things go wrong, because we have an inherent trust of anything that a computer does. Now, the computer will only do what it's told to do. So if we put rubbish in, we'll get rubbish out. So as an industry, we've now kind of developed this regime where we've identified that where people are using electronic performance, errors can take place with incorrect data. Where you're using drop-down boxes and you've selected, dry instead of wet runway, these sorts of things. If they don't get picked up, then you'll get completely erroneous performance data, which if you then go and fly, you might find that you're not flying as soon as you should be, and then you might have a very extended takeoff roll, and you just might scrape the hedge or fence at the end of the runway. So what we do now is we have a rigorous procedure whereby everything is independently cross-checked. And as an industry, we're starting to see better adherence to these practices, and the incidents are becoming less. But like anything else, with pressures of time and, confusion, there's been cases where performance has been done for the full length of the runway because they thought that they'd selected the correct length of runway on the drop-down box, but aircraft have then departed, a third of the way down the runway, because that's what they thought they'd done the performance for, but in fact they did it for a lot longer runway. So we're trying as an industry to really nail the procedures and teach discipline, because as I say to guys who are under my wing for training, this is one of the things that will kill you if you get wrong. And you've got all the time in the world on the ground to get this right. Sometimes we have to deal with problems in the air where we can't just stop the clock and say, okay, we're going to take 5 minutes to do this. Well, you can't in the air, but on the ground you can. That's kind of aircraft performance. There are a lot of environmental aspects to it. So when we have low pressure systems, so stormy weather in the UK, lots of rain, lots of wet runways, low pressure, strong winds, sometimes in the wrong direction, they can all affect our performance. So the weight of the aeroplane, the environmental conditions, the runway length and the runway state are the key elements to that. So hopefully that's answered the question in as much as I can. I'm only a pilot at the end of the day, not a performance engineer.
Not quite. As always, many thanks, Captain Al.
It's a pleasure.
If you'd like to watch more from our great series, then you can do that by pressing here. We've also created you a playlist with all the Plain Truth episodes, and you'll find that just here. Why not like and subscribe to our channel? That way you will be notified whenever we post our great content. Or if you've got a question that you'd like Captain Al to answer, then why not pop it in the comments box below, and you may well feature on an upcoming episode of The Plain Truth.